Hi everyone, it's Friday, January 24th. Let's talk PlayStation. A lot of interesting, titillating things to talk about this week, so let's just jump right into it. The PlayStation 4, now we've talked a lot about this. Its actual hardware design, Sony's philosophy behind the box and why it's slanted, things like that. Well, one interesting thing is that during the, process of making the PlayStation 4, Sony's engineers really stressed that the system had to use under 250 watts of power. And that's actually a design choice because by safety regulations, if you go up above 250 watts, you have to use a 3-prong outlet. So Sony really stressed to go under that to use a 2-prong outlet and then thus keep using the legacy cord that has gone in the back of pretty much every PlayStation hardware. You know the one. It's the same port that's used on PS1, PS2, PS3, and of course the PS4. That same back port that connects into the PlayStation, and then you've got the 2-prong going into the outlet. Interestingly enough, the only actual PlayStation hardware that had a 3-prong outlet was the original fat PlayStation 3. That thing was an 11-pound, huge, big-ass beast. That needed a 3-prong outlet, but then the PS3 Slim and Super Slim went back to the 2-prong. So it's really interesting that Sony really stressed to get under that wattage because the main point was that if they had to use 3-prong, the actual hardware would have been thicker and the box would have actually had to been bigger. So they wanted to really make this thing sleek, small, and just again, all that power crammed into one little box. It's just really impressive. Speaking of hardware and Sony's engineers cramming a lot into one little small box, this segues nicely into our next news story, which is that Sony created a custom PlayStation 3 in-house to use for PlayStation Now. So, PlayStation Now, the streaming service, it's going to stream PlayStation 3 games to all these different devices, but you need a place to actually play these games. Where's the actual hardware playing these games? Sony tested PlayStation Now with regular PlayStation 3s just on a rack, just, streaming the games, right? But it turned out it was using way too much power. There was a little bit of latency there. So what Sony did basically is create a custom PlayStation 3 piece of hardware that encompasses pretty much 8 PlayStation 3s, right? So you've got one piece of hardware, but it's encompassing 8 PlayStation 3s and one motherboard. So this story was reported by Digital Foundry, and Sony, for example, when they're trying to do a streaming service like this, they're not presented with the same issues that another streaming service might have, like on Live. You've got a PlayStation 3 trying to stream PlayStation 3 games, and the kind of hardware that's required for that, the cell processor, the RSX chip, these things can't be heavily manipulated, right? You have to kind of use the standard, which is why Sony tried to use retail boxes to actually get these games to stream over far distances and having low latency. And there's frames per second involved in these games, console games in particular. PS3, most games were standard 30 frames per second, and there was about 100 to 150 millisecond latency issue that Sony wanted to resolve, and the retail units just weren't cutting it. So what Sony basically did, fundamentally, they just put a lot of PS3s into one custom PS3 without modifying it too much to sort of help it speed up the latency and ultimately use less power, which hopefully will make the service better because Sony definitely does have some hurdles to jump with PlayStation Now, and even I predicted that when this thing comes out, it's going to have a lot of issues. So you can see how they're kind of, preparing for this sort of huge jump that they're going to have once the service launches. So, developer Housemarque, you know these guys, right? Developers of Super Stardust HD, Dead Nation, Resogun on the PlayStation 4. Well, they're working on Resogun DLC, which is cool, but they're also working on another unannounced PlayStation 4 exclusive. I mean, I'm assuming it's a PlayStation exclusive. If you go to their Facebook page, they responded to a user saying that they're working on Resogun DLC and another PS4 project. I would assume it's exclusive. Housemarque has a long history with Sony, a good relationship with Sony. So I'm going to assume it's exclusive, and now it's just a matter of what it is, Housemarque makes some pretty damn good games, really fantastic games, so it's always good to hear that they're working on something, right? So my interest is piqued. I'm thoroughly looking forward to it. Speaking of unannounced projects, let's move on to our next news story, which is Double 11. This developer worked on Little Big Planet Vita, and they've done a lot of contract work for porting games to PlayStation. They brought Limbo to PS Vita. That's the one I can think off the top of my head, but they've done other projects like that as well. Well, they're working on porting another PlayStation exclusive to PS4 and Vita. So we don't know what it is, but that is what they're saying. Lee Hutchinson, the founder of Double 11, was on Twitter straight up confirming this, that they're bringing a current PlayStation exclusive, those are the only words we know, and they're bringing it to PlayStation 4 and Vita. Now, this would make sense, because we've seen this before. Flowers come to PS Vita and PS4, Flow has come over, Sound Shapes has come over to PS4. totally makes sense. So now it's just a matter of what it is. And they're saying it's going to be announced fairly soon, within the next month possibly, so we'll have to keep our eyes out for that as well. Moving on to some negative news that Sony is always good at having, PlayStation 4 Errors. So this was a big thing going on this past week. There was a PlayStation thread that blew up with a bunch of pages, people discussing that they're having errors with their PlayStation 4 and their game saves being deleted, like hours of progress being gone. And it's been a really huge issue. It's error code, blah, 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 because I of course don't have that memorized. But it's the same issue that a lot of people have been getting. Not only that, but there are also a couple of reports of people having problems with PS4's group chat, and it corrupting people's consoles and disabling it, not being able to delete messages and open apps properly. And these two issues may or may not be connected, but the group chat issue is PSN side. Like, it's a whole big shitstorm. Now, Sony's responses to all these issues is the casual PR stuff, like, reinitialize the system, boot into safe mode, do this and that, the standard stuff. And some people are saying it works, and some people are saying it's not working. Most people are just coming up with their own fixes for these issues. But once again, when I usually discuss things like this is just crap on Sony's side. Like, they need to take better control of these issues, not let them happen in the first place. This is just standard Sony stuff that they always do, and it's not good for them because all these websites will post this information and then it just looks bad on them. And it's usually the same thing every time. There's a certain error code that everybody gets. It's usually almost always a PSN side issue, so it's something that Sony's doing that's inflicting other people's consoles, and then they have to fix it. But all these websites start reporting on it, and then Sony has to respond to all these PR questions, basically giving the PR answer, like, oh, well, people can do this, or they can call us here. It's just they do this all the time. It seems to happen every 4 to 5 months, some sort of PlayStation issue where Sony does something and it messes up systems. And the really shitty thing about it is if someone's console gets bricked from one of these many problems that happens over the years with Sony, or if they lose their game saves, it totally sucks, right? Like, there's nothing that can be really said or done about it if those things end up happening. But when you're an owner of all these platforms and you predominantly play on all these platforms, you have to be one of those users who's constantly uploading their saves to the cloud, or you have to have a storage backup and keep it backed up every so often. Keep doing a new backup so you have all your saves and everything updated. But it's one of those situations where you shouldn't have to be doing that, right? You shouldn't have to be. It's just like, it's the standard Sony crap, like, they do this all the time, and that's a huge issue with them. Now, on a much more positive note, let's go into our next news story, which is Tomb Raider the Definitive Edition. You must have been hearing about this these past few days. Big shitstorm going on. Tomb Raider the Definitive Edition is running 60 frames per second on the PlayStation 4 and only 30 frames per second on the Xbox One. Now, generally speaking, and honestly, I usually don't cover stuff like this where it comes to power or resolution differences or frame rate differences. I usually don't cover that stuff because I don't usually, it's just, I don't know. I know it's a huge thing for people. I know this is a huge thing people like to talk about. Consumers deserve to know these things and what they're investing their money in. I totally get that. But for me, I want to talk about really important news. And I guess one thing about this show that you've noticed is we talk about business. We talk about the mass market. We talk about mass consumers, right? So that encompasses everybody. So when you talk about resolution and power and differences, usually that stuff doesn't matter to the mass market, because at the end of the day, frames per second and resolution isn't going to matter to your standard consumer, and it ultimately isn't going to affect sales numbers that greatly. So I guess that's why I usually don't talk about this stuff. But when it does get this big, like we've been having too many of these stories go around nowadays when it comes to PS4 versus Xbox One, it gets to the point where it could be a huge business thing. It could be sort of a huge groundbreaking thing for the industry. Now, why would I say groundbreaking? Well, it could go into a whole big scenario, right? I mean, when you have a power difference this big, which is what I think we're really starting to realize now, is that the power difference between these two machines is really that big. I mean, it's this early into the game, and we actually are seeing major differences. Like, Square Enix right now is saying that they actually did try to get 60 frames per second on both consoles, and they won't say it directly, but it's pretty clear that they couldn't achieve it on Xbox One. Now, we also had the Call of Duty fiasco, where Call of Duty is running 720p on X1 and 1080p on PS4. It seems like the power difference is really there, and it's really getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, for Microsoft, they're in a, they're dealing with problems. They got their PR needs to get together. They need to start getting their act together and talking to people about it and trying to control like they've got a whole big scenario going on. And clearly this is good news for Sony. They built a powerful box. It's $100 cheaper than their biggest competition, but this could pose a real issue down the line in terms of Microsoft staying lean, mean, and competitive. Here's a little example. Microsoft has a program called ID at Xbox that's independent developers at Xbox, and that's their kind of initiative to get indie developers onto Xbox. And that's sort of the change that they did to start competing with what Sony was doing, which was really helping out indie developers, right? Good stuff on them, right? But if you look into that further, there's actually a lot of clauses and like a list of terms that Microsoft requires if you want to make games on Xbox One. And one thing they have is a parity agreement, which basically says that if you want to release a game on Xbox One, you have to release the game the same day as other platforms. There can't be an exclusivity agreement with the other platforms. You can't release a game on PlayStation 6 weeks earlier and then try to get it on Xbox, because then Microsoft would likely, in this contract, in this sort of agreement, they'd say, well then no, you can't get your game on here. So and most developers would say, okay, well, I don't want my game to not be on two platforms. Two platforms means more money, so that they would hold back the PlayStation release or exclusivity to release on both platforms at the same time, and then Microsoft gets the win there because they just took away an exclusivity agreement from another company. Microsoft does things like that, which is a smart business move, though. It may look evil in their sense, but if they want to stay competitive, that's kind of the thing that you need to do. Whether you find it vindictive and evil or not, it's certainly a smart choice on their part. But that's indie developers, and in some cases, and what a lot of people are saying on regards to the ID at Xbox topic, is that some developers would just stay on PlayStation if that were the case, right? If they don't want to deal with Microsoft's parity clauses and agreements, they would just stay on PlayStation. They would be happy with not going on Xbox. That's a choice that I think a lot of indie developers could make if they want to do that route. But when you start talking about big publishers and big developers like EA and Square Enix and Respawn with Titanfall, you get to a certain point where Microsoft will stay very competitive right there. They paid how much, God knows how much money they paid for that Titanfall exclusivity agreement. Microsoft will do those things. And when you've got a situation where their box is clearly weaker and it's this information is becoming more widely known that games are better on PlayStation 4, Microsoft could step in and say, they could come up with some sort of clause like that. They could come up with some sort of agreement saying, you can't do this, you can't do that, we won't support you, or we won't, like, publishers and developers want money. They want to release on both PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. Microsoft has the weaker box. They could do something like that. And publishers and developers don't want to miss out on that potential money that they would make by selling their games on Xbox One. I mean, all I'm saying is that could happen. I mean, the thing with ID at Xbox, that's definitely happening. And in some cases, Microsoft will work with developers on a case-by-case basis, that even if they did have an exclusivity agreement, they could, on a case-by-case basis, try and still get their game on Xbox. But for the most part, what they have with those agreements, that contract, that very much so is real. But when you start talking about higher profile games that make millions and millions of dollars, like Tomb Raider, it looks bad on Microsoft's part. They sell less software, they make less money, and their competition gets better and better. So they got to stay competitive. They certainly could do something like that, because Microsoft's a very competitive company when it comes to that stuff. Microsoft does it all the time. They'll pay for third party. They'll pay for exclusives. If they don't have first party developers, which they do have, but if they didn't have them, they would just pay for all this stuff, because that's what they do. And I would assume they make a return on it because they keep doing it over and over again. But it sells hardware, it sells software, and that's good for them. But Sony generally won't do that stuff. They'll maybe ask for 6 months exclusivity with a specific game, but they won't approach a third-party developer and say, hey, we like that game, we want it completely exclusive, and we want to claim part ownership of it or whatever. They won't usually do that. Developers like Quantic Dream will approach Sony, say, we have a cool idea, and Sony will say, okay, we'll fund it and we'll publish it. But they won't go out seeking stuff like that, whereas Microsoft will. And if they're dealing with this sort of issue where they've clearly got a weaker box, they could be facing an uphill battle. It really is interesting, though, because I didn't think the power gap was that big. We knew it was there from the get-go. A lot of developers even would straight out tell you PlayStation 4 is the better hardware. But it is interesting to keep seeing stuff like this happening, where there's more frames per second on PS4 or more resolution on PS4. And like I said, it's good for Sony, right? They made a powerful box, they made a smaller box, they made a sleeker box. Great on them. but they could be facing a battle with Microsoft if Microsoft keeps dealing with these sort of issues of their hardware being quote-unquote underpowered compared to them. I guess what's really, really interesting is what we're going to see in the long run, right, in the next 3-4 years from now. Both systems are going to get driver updates and optimizations. Some RAM that's reserved for the OS is going to get freed up for more game developers, and these games are going to look better and better over time. Consoles can be highly optimized over all these years, so I think it's interesting to see where the systems will be 3-4 years from now, and if driver updates and optimization can really help Microsoft in the long run, or if it will only widen that gap between the two in terms of power, or if developers will from now on say, you know what, we don't want to be getting all this media attention when it comes to us favoring one system over the other, or making a game better on one platform or the other, or they'll start maybe gimping one version to keep it level with the other. These things have happened in the industry before. I'm not saying that they happen all the time, but it does happen most of the time. And because this is an internet video, and we're talking about both platforms, and we're talking about them versing each other, and I said a lot of somewhat negative things about Microsoft that were true, just to put it out there up front, don't fight or get crazy and be fanboys and stuff. You guys know I try to stay factual and have thought-provoking conversations on these topics, so let's hopefully keep that civil in the comments below. That concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you so much for talking with me, and I'll see you next Friday.